That is the estimate of how much the government has had to spend to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The ongoing COVID pandemic has negatively impacted us all socially, mentally, physically, and some would say above all, economically. Jamaicans, like many other citizens across the world, has had their livelihoods impacted by the pandemic, whether it's the loss of a job, reduction in income, or the closure of a business. Tens of thousands of Jamaicans found themselves in need of financial assistance. Good evening to all those joining us on the various social media platforms. Before going further, I would sincerely like to apologize for the delay in the start of the broadcast, which was due to technical difficulties beyond our control. I'm Joanna Callan, a researcher here at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, and welcome to our public forum, Following the Money, the COVID edition. The COVID-19 edition because this is our second installment of Following the Money. CAPRI has partnered with the International Budget Partnership to promote transparency and accountability of the budget of the government of Jamaica, to advocate for reform and to build awareness and knowledge among Jamaicans so that they may participate in a process and have a voice that impacts their lives. Tonight's edition of Following the Money looks at how the government managed the budget during the pandemic. Our event tonight is a little different from our usual format. Our researcher, Shauna K. Chisholm, will first give the presentation. And rather than our usual panel discussion, the presentation will be followed by a conversation between our Executive Director, Dr. Damian King, and Minister of Finance and Public Service, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark. This format will also allow those viewing an opportunity to have their questions answered. We would like you, our valued audience, to go to sli.do and enter the event code CAPRI. Our participants are encouraged to submit their question to Drs. King and Clark throughout the conversation. And we actually have our first poll question up and ready, and we'd like you to go and answer. How much do you trust the government's handling of the COVID-19 spending? I now invite our presenter, Shauna Kay, to start.
Standing in his office, looking out, knowing that he has to throw $25 billion through the window, not knowing where it would go or the direction the wind will blow. Never before in the recorded economic history of Jamaica has the government spent an equivalent of $25 billion adjusted for inflation on a single disaster. 25 billion is just 2% of the entire budget. Now, to put this in context, that is the sum or the equivalent to half of the total cost for the Southern Coastal Highway. That is the highway being built from Nathan to Williamsfield and through St. Thomas to Port Antonio. It is a lot of money. It is an unfortunate fact of life that governments and large sum of money, especially when brand new ventures are involved, don't always have the best outcomes. In Jamaica, and of course around the world, it is not uncommon for there to be wastage, leakage, misuse, and misallocation of funds. With a new project, the system, procedures, and people who the fund might have passed through are very unfamiliar. Money can slip through the gaps, whether intentional or not. Jamaica recorded its first COVID-19 case on March 10, 2020, just 1 month after the government of Jamaica had tabulated its $853 billion budget for the 2020-21 fiscal year. Another month later, the government had launched a $19 billion stimulus package, allocating $1 billion for public health and $5 billion for vaccination when they became available. With so much money, especially and unplanned for money, a lot could have gone wrong. For example, the selection process could have been corrupted. There could have been a costly delivery of the funds, costly meaning high administrative costs, high processing costs, or other logistical costs. Some parts of the funds might have been misdirected to unintended recipients. But what we really want to know is, what is the money being spent on? Who is spending it? And for what purpose? CAPRI did an in-depth examination as to how well the Jamaican government did in this extraordinary situation. How did they manage the large amount of money that was allocated for the COVID-19 pandemic? Using the standardized categories for assessing fiscal management, the assessment focused on transparency, which is the access to information; oversight, which speaks about the monitoring and auditing of the budget; and participation, which really talks about where their ability for citizens to engage. So starting with the last point, the assessment revealed that there was little to no input from the public as it relates to the formulation and implementation of the stimulus spending. But this is really not a remarkable finding, as public participation and citizens' engagement has never been a part of the budgetary process in Jamaica. This was pointed out in the 2021 CAPRI's budget report. Also, there are few countries that do successfully incorporate the citizens' input into the formulation of the budget. You see, the truth is, it is not easy or practical for any government, particularly in a crisis, to implement a brand new system and seek out accommodations for public opinion. So going back to the first issue, transparency, and forgive me for not going in the sequential manner, but you'll soon understand why is that. The overall process was quite transparent. The minister communicated with the public even before the budgets were due. Announcements were made about what the government was going to do before it was done. For example, on September the 3rd, the minister made it be known that the first supplementary budget was being formulated and it would have addressed the critical needs emerging in Jamaica. As is always the case, the parliament debated on the proposed revised budget before voting on it. The budget came quite early in this exercise, despite there being a great deal of uncertainty. The government had to draft a second supplementary budget, which had an additional spending of $15.7 billion, and this was to include the COVID crisis. This was done in time to present to Parliament and be approved by the House of Representatives on October the 13th. No, this is the first time a supplementary budget reaches the Parliament in October. The usual date would be late November, early December. So overall, the government scored really well on transparency. But the real danger in this situation is number 2, oversight. Where there is large unexpected spending in new ways, going through new channels without oversight, this is where things might get a bit sticky. Even more critically, because there's so much money involved, by the time oversight comes in, what we discover is the amount of money that had already gone awry. And by that time, there's really nothing we can do about it. But here is what Jamaica did. The Ministry of Finance engaged the Auditors General to monitor the COVID spending as the money was being spent. It is what we can call a real-time audit. What this is meant by the Auditor General monitored the money as it was being allocated for different uses. So, should the money have been misused, it would have been identified right away, the gaps plugged, and stem the flow for any further misallocation. So, for example, the real-time audit found that there were duplications in the cash transfer system. However, they were able to identify the error, fix the issue, and execute the proper procedure in a timely manner. Only a handful of countries in the world got this done. These findings are contained in the report that CAPRI did in collaboration with the International Open Budgetary Partnership. 120 countries conducted a similar exercise using the same parameter and methodology, so we could measure Jamaica's COVID fiscal management against that of the other countries. No. The findings revealed that Jamaica scored among the top countries in terms of accountability. After assessing other countries' response to COVID-19 spending, IBP named Jamaica as one of the best practice case studies that should be an example to the rest of the world. In moving forward, it is recommended to integrate innovation and good practices such as real-time auditing that emerged during COVID-19 into the regular budgetary proceedings for future emergencies, and perhaps as a part of the regular budget, the government might want to consider public partnership, modeling the Economic Program Oversight Committee, EPOC, which was very successful during the two IMF programs. Finally, the government of Jamaica could and should provide up-to-date information on web portals, including data and analysis on budget execution, performance, disaggregated by relevance to and impact on disadvantaged groups such as disabled and women and girls. In doing these, the Minister of Finance will be sure which way the wind blows outside his window.
We now welcome to this discussion the Minister of Finance and Public Service, the Honorable Nigel Clark. Welcome, Minister.
Hi, Damien. Thank you for having me. I'm not hearing you well, though. Something is the audio piece.
So,
yeah, better.
Minister, we now know that Jamaica is amongst the world leaders in sprinting, in netball, and now apparently in managing expenditure in an emergency. How you feel?
Just doing my job, Damien. Doing my job.
Well, according to our international comparison, as the presentation showed, In this particular regard, you did your job, and Jamaica seemed to have performed extraordinarily well. As our research showed, Jamaica was selected as a kind of a worldwide best practice. The goal scorer for Jamaica that made that high ranking in terms of emergency expenditure management possible was having external auditing as the process unfolded. Now, as many of you would know, and of course you'll be familiar with this, Minister, that external auditing is something that comes in after the financial year has been finished, and then you bring in the external auditors to forensically look back at your processes to see what went awry. The decision was made in this case, and apparently on your initiative, to ask the Auditor General Department to come in during the process, what we call real-time auditing. Just tell us how that came about.
Yeah. So, Damien, this was a once in I guess, a century crisis. We had never had an economic shock of this magnitude. My budget presentation was the 10th of March, the same day as our first case. And by March 22nd, when I closed the budget presentation, I outlined the contours of the care program, and it opened on the 9th of April. I remember going up to eGov and meeting with the programmers myself on a Sunday and saying, look, can you deliver on what we need? The the mechanisms for this kind of intervention did not exist. The vulnerable that were created were newly vulnerable. They were not on any database that the government had. We had to create the mechanisms to reach them. Now, once we opened on April 9th, and within a couple of days, we had 349,000 applications. Right? It was very clear that there was no precedent in Jamaica's history for the scale and the breadth of the intervention that would be required. And just cognizant of the low public trust that exists in Jamaica, one, and two, the difficulty in that we have had as a country of bringing, individuals to account for kind of skullduggery, right? So in the United States, I'm going to just digress for a little bit, Damon. In the United States, they can afford to have a system where they don't need to audit up front because they know on the back end, the FBI is definitely going to get you, as we're seeing now if you misrepresent and so forth, and as we're seeing with the COVID misrepresentation cases that are flooding the United States. In our case, public trust is low, and we don't have those sort of systems on the back end. So, as the person who was responsible, I just felt the need to reach out to the Auditor General, and I had, good people who provided me with advice as well, to seek her agreement on whether or not she could do a concurrent audit. So I wrote to her. And in that letter that I wrote to her, I set out and I said, look, the scale of this intervention that's going to be required is on a level that we have never done before. The government of Jamaica has never distributed this volume of funds before. And we've never had to do it in such a short space of time on a system that does not exist. And so I laid that out in a letter and asked the Auditor General's department or office whether they would be willing and available to conduct concurrent audits on the application system, because the application was just developed in a matter of weeks, and on the disbursement. So prior to the disbursement going through the banking system, the audit would take place, and we would have the results of those audits so that we could make corrections before the payments were made.
So you mentioned that you're operating in a context where there's low trust in government. We asked a poll question of those who were watching earlier, how much trust people had in government's handling of COVID expenditures. Let's have a look now at the results of that poll. somewhat, 40% somewhat trusted the government's handling of the expenditure, 35% mostly, and about a quarter of the population, very little or not at all. So yeah, that exposes and exemplifies the low trust situation that you said you're in. When you spoke about having to sort of, in a matter of days actually, to build the system that was going to deliver this cash and identify the recipients by the application process you set up, it really exposed, sadly, that we lack an effective social safety net system in Jamaica. That the identification of the recipients of need, even though the stimulus, the trigger, was unprecedented, if we had a responsive and dynamic and robust safety net system, then you would not have had to, build the plane while flying it. So doesn't this speak to the fact that once we get out of the emergency situation and the pandemic panic, that a priority of this government shouldn't be to look at Jamaica's social safety net and how to make it stronger and better?
Let me answer that question in two parts. The first part, Damien, is that this crisis created a new class of vulnerable, right? The persons who were made vulnerable by COVID-19, by and large, were not vulnerable before COVID-19. So traditional social safety net systems wouldn't have helped in this situation. Recall that the 150,000 persons who lost their jobs were employed people. And for the most part, there were people who were employed for years and years and years. They were not in the category of the vulnerable. Having a social safety net system outside of unemployment insurance would not have helped them. In addition, the businesses who are suppliers to the tourism industry and the small hotels and the persons who operated taxis and were riverboat captains and in the culinary and entertainment space, those are not persons who would have appeared in any social safety net database, right? They were what I call newly vulnerable. And that is why we needed a freshly designed mechanism to reach those persons, for those persons to be able to self-identify over their phone, over their tablet, or over their computer, and put their hand up and say, look, I am affected by this, I'm applying for this particular grant. Now, having said that, we had a COVID economic review task force, and one of the recommendations coming out of that is that the government of Jamaica, accelerates a feasibility study on unemployment insurance. I'm happy to say that we have acted on that recommendation, and we are far advanced in feasibility study on unemployment insurance. And at some stage, very shortly, we'll be engaging the Jamaican society on the policy choices that lie before us as far as that is concerned. The advantage of unemployment insurance is that you have a funded program to deal with sudden change in employment status of Jamaican citizens. And that can act as an economic and stabilizer in times of crisis, therefore alleviating the central government, the consolidated fund, of the pressure that usually comes in crisis for some kind of social response. And some countries, had unemployment insurance going into this crisis, and that helped somewhat. So I would say that yes, coming out, yes. So the first answer is, remember, newly vulnerable because of COVID. So even having pre-existing systems wouldn't have been sufficient. You'd had to have new mechanisms to reach the new vulnerable. However, the point is definitely made that enriching, deepening our social security systems with the introduction of unemployment insurance is something that the government is paying serious attention to, and the feasibility study is far advanced. I hope to say more on this in my budget presentation.
Minister, I see your point that a lot were newly vulnerable and would not have been newly exposed and would not have been identified as vulnerable before. But at the same time, those that are at the bottom of the income ladder, the marginalized, those two were affected. Those are the ones who were informally employed, who were hustling. They were affected as well. They didn't lose formal sector jobs, but they lost mobility. They lost their ability to move about and do their little hustling. And those two were missed. In fact, CAPRI published a report last year on vulnerable communities that we called insult to injury. And one of the findings of that report was that the neediest communities, we did a survey in the neediest communities and extensive interviews, and 3/4 of the poorest in our society received no assistance, not in-kind assistance, no packages, no cash, either public or private. Surely, even taking your point about all those that were newly added to the needy, surely we have to have a system that does better with the ones who are previously needy and were made worse.
Right. So
which is back to our poor social safety net system.
Right. No, let's be clear. Our social safety net system needs reform in order to broaden its reach. Our two flagship social security support systems, the National Insurance Fund or National Insurance Scheme and the PATH program, only capture a fraction of the target population. There are no more than 400 and odd thousand contributors to the National Insurance Scheme out of an employed workforce of just under 1.3 million. That is a significant gap. The PATH program has reaches about 400,000 persons, which I think is a very reasonable number given the target that it aims to reach. However, so let me say our intervention came in different forms, right? It came through productivity incentives to farmers and fishermen. It came through members of parliament with care programs. And it also came with various stipends that were added to PATH families. So we reached just under 500,000 people from the core care program that you accessed over the internet on your mobile phone and so forth. And that really is the subject of what we're talking about today. But we also had intervention through the PATH program where there's 130,000 heads of households or 400,000 families who would have been reached through that particular modality. We had the farmers and the fishermen, $1 billion in productive incentive grants through that particular modality and so forth. Now, I'm not going to challenge the results of your survey, but I recall at the time when it was published, it mentioned, whether they received a CARE grant or not. And I would totally understand if not all those who were in receipt would have identified it as CARE because it ultimately came through different modalities, some of which I've mentioned here. But let me just get back to the central element of your point. Yes, Jamaica, there's a lot of improvement that we can make to our social assistance database. And the Ministry of Finance has been working very closely with the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. The Ministry of Finance developed the social pension program, obviously with input and data and assistance from the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. And the Ministry of Labor is the ministry that's implementing it, but it was developed in the Ministry of Finance. And there we aim to build a database of elderly persons who are poor and who are not in receipt of any kind of income. They're not on PATH, they're not on NIS, and they have no other form of income. And that database has been built. So one by one, slowly but surely, we are plugging the gaps in that social safety net system. But the point is, accepted generally.
So we're taking questions from the people who are viewing on our social media platforms using a website called slido.com. So you can go to slido.com and put in the event code CAPRI, and you can join in placing questions or voting questions up. And Minister, while we've been talking about, the total amount of money spent, one viewer on Slido, and it seems to be quite a popular question because it's been well supported, is asking how much was spent specifically on the information program, the public education on pandemic-related information as a counter to the misinformation that is part of why we have such a low, take-up of vaccines.
Well, I don't have that statistic here because we were focusing here on the social intervention expenditure. So I don't have that particular data on, and that would be a Ministry of Health sort of line item. So I don't have that data here, David, unfortunately. But let me just say this, that, it's very good that the way in which we targeted this intervention in order to achieve public trust. And I think the poll that you showed, you had 70% of persons who were saying they had some amount of trust in the disbursements, and that I was very pleasantly surprised to see those results, and they probably point to what you're talking about. But it was achieved at some cost, right? Because having the Auditor General or asking Auditor General to come in and to engage in concurrent audits meant that there's a delay in people receiving the grants, okay? And that delay had a cost to it. People complained, people were upset, people didn't understand, right? And, as a policymaker, we had to weigh two objectives, which are both valid objectives. The first objective is to ensure not only are the funds distributed transparently, but they are seen to be distributed transparently, right? Without fear or favor, and, technically and administratively transparently. But the second objective is to get funds out fast. And those objectives were in conflict. And we had to resolve that conflict. And we resolved that conflict in favor of the first, which is, and you resolve conflicts, policy conflicts like that, in the context in which your society, in the context of your society and the context of your time. And given the context of Jamaica, we thought that policy objective of disbursing in a way that enhances public trust trumped the objective of getting the funds out quickly. So policy choices always have trade-offs. I don't want to make it that there's always a trade-off. And the trade-off should be highlighted and identified. But we stand behind that trade-off, but I want it just to be recognized.
It is. I think a lot of viewers and listeners would find it impressive that, notwithstanding the urgency of the situation and the dire conditions into which households were thrown, that you prioritized probity and confidence by holding up some of the expenditures until the Auditor General had gotten to the stage where they could, sort of sign off on the validity and the properness of the process. And we can take some comfort from that. And that is why you say there seemed to have been so much confidence. I say all of that to say that, so you take a dim view of the fact that you want to highlight the 75% or so that has confidence, while in my introduction, I highlighted the 25% who had low confidence. So
we're in different jobs, right?
Nicely done. Let me go to the area of assessment in which the government scored poorly. Mm-hmm. And if you recall, we published a report last year, the original Following the Money, mm-hmm. in which we assessed the overall budget process along the same three metrics: transparency, participation, and oversight. And the government scored poorly on participation then and scored poorly on participation now. And we have put that in the context of the difficulty of facilitating public participation in a budget process in any case. And a lot of countries also score badly on public participation. Nonetheless, the people who know a lot about the importance of openness, including the International Budget Partnership that we are affiliated with in doing this kind of work, they think it's really important. So what do you think of our recommendation that an epoch-style committee, a social partnership committee, is one way to try to bring some public participation into the budget process, and you would consult them during the development of the budget?
That's a very weighty question, Damien.
Thank you. I worked on it all day.
Yes, our system works on representation, and that people are represented in Parliament, and parliamentarians, in just how our system works, represent their constituents
nominally.
Right. Let me just on the COVID sort of intervention. I mean, I noticed your report said no public what do you call it, consultation, but you did highlight the fact that we had 3 weeks with which to build a system and respond, and I had to announce something within 10 days, and as I said, March 10th to 12 days, March 10th to March 22nd. During the period March 10th to March 22nd, I'd have engaged in a lot of consultations. However, I'd have spoken to a lot of people who are also critics, people who criticize the government. I call them up. I won't call anybody's name now until I get their permission, but I called people up. People with lots of experience in social policy and who are common critics of the government on social media. I engaged with them directly, heard their views, and incorporated some of their suggestions. So it was not broad-based mass sort of consultation
or formal
in the streets, nor was it formal. But within the space of the 12 days that we had to respond, I'd have reached out to persons from across the spectrum, getting different points of view on what people saw coming and what various people thought would be necessary. But it was not a formal and by any means process.
One of our viewers, Minister, is pointing out people are still suffering. We haven't come out of the pandemic yet. Why hasn't there been another tranche of the CARE program?
Well, in the supplementary budget, the first supplementary in October, we launched, last in March, we had the vaccine incentive, in which to date over 40,000 people have received those grants. In September, we extended the set cash grant, where persons who were on set cash as at, I think it was April or May of 2021, and who were still not on the employment roll as adjudicated by Tax Administration Jamaica as at September 30th, 2021, they got just a one-off grant on September, because it would have meant that they would have been out of employment from March of 2020. We also introduced a worker scheme where persons who earn $15,000 a week or less received a one-off grant from the government. And we introduced grants that paid out to persons on the formal databases. So and this was in November and December, just 2 months ago, where every pensioner who is on the NIS scheme, who has a pension of $15,000 a month or less, received a one-off grant in November of $10,000. Every social pensioner, and there are approximately 130 sorry, so let me back up. So persons who receive NIS pensions of $10,000 or less, $15,000 or less, received a one-off grant of $10,000, and there are 57,000 such persons, and they received their grant in November or December. We had 5,000 social pensioners who received a one-off grant of $10,000. We had 130,000 PATH households who received a one-off grant of $10,000. So that's 130,000 plus 5,000, 135 plus 57. That's 192,000 Jamaicans between November and December of last year who received further care program grants. And if you add the set cash grant for persons as at September 30th, that was another 30,000. So 222,000 Jamaicans who received grants in the installation of the care program over the past, certainly, since October of last year.
Viewers, not to reduce mathematics to arithmetic, but that is what you get when you have a mathematician as your Minister of Finance. You get calculations live. We have a brilliant question on Slido from a Portmore resident. And it is that, given that we spoke about the weakness of our existing social safety net and the impressive job in building this architecture of distribution for the purposes of the emergency spending of the pandemic, how much of that architecture can we port over to our regular social safety net? How much is it useful as a regular part of government's obligation to the needy?
Right. They say necessity is the mother of invention. And, COVID proved that rule because no one would have ever believed that you could deliver, right, fiscal resources to 500,000 people within a matter of weeks without anybody going and signing any paper in any office. In fact, many people never believed that this would happen. I went into communities and persons with just their phone. We had hundreds of thousands of people just using their phone and plugging in their information, and their money came to their remittance agency or to their bank account. And what that proved a couple of things. It proved that, one, if the system is simple enough, Jamaicans will access this. Don't tell me that Jamaicans not digitally ready or not ready for online systems. In this case, the application form just asks for name, TRN, address, date of birth, maybe 10, bank account, 10 or 12 fields, very, very simple, that could be filled out in 120 seconds or less. And we had 500,000 Jamaicans filling out that form within a matter of weeks. In fact, between April 9th of 2020 and April 14th of 2020, we had 349,000 applications in 5 days, all through mobile phones, tablets, or computers. That for me was very refreshing as we move towards a digital age and as we try to get Jamaicans to adopt online means of engaging. So anytime you hear people saying that, boy, people not taking it up, it's not because they can't take it up, because we're proven it, right? We've run the test, and we've proven that Jamaicans will use online systems if, one, it's simple enough, and two, they perceive there's a benefit. If they don't perceive a benefit, okay? So that to me is something that we can carry forward into the reform of our social safety net and social intervention systems. That Jamaicans, certainly Jamaicans who are the targets of these kind of systems, are ready for a digital means of engagement. I think that's very encouraging, and it's something that we continue to build on.
I want to use the major factor behind Jamaica's high score in managing the emergency COVID expenditure, which is the decision for the Auditor General's department to come in and externally audit some of the processes in real time. I want to use that decision as a segue into a broader question or comment, really, about your stewardship of the Ministry of Finance. And just public governance in general, certainly financial governance. You have tended not only to make changes at the level of actions and policies, but looking deeply at what you have done while you've been Minister of Finance, you have tried to embed improvements in processes and institutions. You've tried to institutionalize a lot of the improvements. Let me give one example. The government has not only acted to improve the quality and operations of public boards, but you have sought to put in place regulations that institutionalize better appointments to boards. We not only have a different monetary policy in terms of inflation targeting, but you have institutionalized that with legislation to back up inflation targeting and legislation to make the Bank of Jamaica independent. So the action of bringing in the Auditor General seems to me to simply be a part of this approach of yours, to approach improvements not just in different actions, but in embedding those actions in regulations and institutions that was going to have a legacy after your time. I wonder if you could just elaborate on your thinking on that. Just, how just talk about that for me.
Sure. So, Damian, in my own sort of journey, intellectual journey, I've been a part of debates while a student and long after about what is responsible for the divergence in development between and among countries. Right? Is it climate? Is it people? Is it policy? Or is it institutions? And long before I came into this office, having done my own, anecdotal and other, been a part of discussions over many, many years, I'm firmly of the view that institutions make the difference in development. That institutions that provide the right framework, that provide the right set of incentives and disincentives, are what in the long run leads to the resource allocation and the policies and the implementation that are required for a country to climb the ladder of development. And so I've taken this approach quite consciously, with the firm conviction that people are the same everywhere. The Jamaican who leaves Jamaica and might be unruly here, or might be perceived to be unruly, or might be perceived to be good for nothing, leaves and goes to the United States, takes on 2 jobs, and in 20 years, they have a house and a holiday house, and they're seen as productive, responsible citizens. And I often bristle at the condemnation that we visit upon ourselves right in Jamaica. The critiques that we sit, from one tower to another, because there are several towers. There's the Ivory Tower academic, there's the media, there are the political parties. Everybody's in a tower somewhere, and just spewing invectives, right? Essentially about other Jamaicans and about our society, and seeing ourselves. We live to see the day where we begin to see ourselves in the way that all colonizers used to see us, right? And for me, the explanation for a lot of the weaknesses that we identify in each other those explanations lie in institutional failures and institutional deficiencies. And I would like to see, analysis and critiques that take into account those factual realities, and instead of the kind of analysis and critique that leads us to see ourselves as less than, and leads young people to grow up in a Jamaica with a psyche that sees us as, less than, when in fact the failures are institutional in nature. You put the right institutions in place, you have the right set of incentives and disincentives, you have the right set of, as I said, the institutional architecture, and you will get a different kind of behavior. You'll get a different kind of outcome. So this is, you're being a very keen observer to be able to connect the dots between things that are seemingly disconnected. But you're correct in your observation that they're connected from a deep intellectual conviction that the path of development, or path to development of Jamaica, lies heavily on reforming, establishing, renewing, and investing in institutions, because we are blessed and endowed with the same capacities as people anywhere. What we lack are strong institutions.
So having segued, Minister, into your broader approach to the management of your portfolio, from the discussion on the management of emergency spending caused by the pandemic, let me now bring those two back together.
Mm. We
share a view on the importance of institutional development and institutional strength. One of the positive secrets of public sector management in Jamaica and effective, no, let me not say effective, but competent institutions, the secret is the Auditor General's Department, which does a tremendous job. If you read through the reports of the Auditor General, you see it identifies a lot of the problems in the management of public sector institutions in Jamaica. You decided to bring in the Auditor General's Department to monitor the emergency spending. But the Auditor General does her job after the fact, forensically, with all the public agencies, produces these high quality reports that identifies issues, and then nothing happens. The issues that the Auditor General identifies in our audits go on year after year. So here is an institutional failure that in departments and ministries that are not yours, not your ministry, agencies can ignore the Auditor General's reports. So what is the institutional development now to give those reports to increase accountability based on what the Auditor General is able to do?
No, thank you for that question. You're absolutely correct that in a free society and a democratic society, the role of the Supreme Audit Institution is crucial, which is why that institution is embedded in our Constitution and reports only to Parliament, and has independence and has security of tenure and other institutional structures to protect the integrity of that office. I agree with you that oftentimes the recommendations of the Auditor General and the findings go unheeded, and in some cases we do have repeat offenses. However, we have also seen where the Auditor General's reports leads to change in the composition of an institution or in the leadership of institutions and so forth. I I certainly believe that Parliament plays a very key role. And whenever Parliament digs into an Auditor General's report, you tend to get responses. Maybe one of the problems, one of the things that we have to work on is that the pursuit of Auditor General's reports tends to be over the course of time and across governments and oppositions of varying types. There's an argument, at least. I'm not saying this is, there's an argument, it's at least arguable, that the pursuit of Auditor General's reports through the parliamentary process has been partisan in its motivation, i.e., it's pursued when there's a perceived political advantage to pursuing it. So the question is, because we have definitely seen that, right? We have seen under various administrations throughout the 2010s, the 2000s, etc. We have seen the PAC doggedly pursue Auditor General's reports. And what has happened in the past is that where there's a perceived partisan political advantage to driving home a particular lapse or failure by zeroing in on that report and keeping it in a news cycle week after week, that critique doesn't apply in those instances because there's great focus on it. But there are other times when reports are produced that may not seem to have that partisan political advantage, when they're not, and as a result, we don't have the uproar, in Parliament. The Auditor General reports to Parliament, and so the solution has to rely on Parliament, and we have to, the response has to be such that these reports can receive attention and light of day, even if it does not hold, by perception or in reality, a partisan political advantage for one side over other. I mean, there's an advantage to the Jamaican society for exposing, but it also, the culture around the reports as well has to also change. The kind of gotcha approach sometimes in the media, take zeroing in and leaving out the broader context, and a dramatization. What needs to happen is that all reports, need to go through the parliamentary process and receive, responses and commitments for the failings to be addressed.
Now that we have had a presentation of our report, and the minister and I have had a discussion about various aspects of the report and CAPRI's assessment of how well the government performed in this area, I would like to invite our viewers who are on Slido, slido.com, the event code is CAPRI, to go now to our second poll, which is the same question, and to tell us, having listened to this discussion, how much trust you now have in the government's handling of the COVID-related spending. So participate in the poll, and I'll give you the results after I give the minister the opportunity to address one more issue. Minister, think about the particular juncture that our economy is at right at this moment. We're emerging from certainly fiscally, but definitely economically, the greatest disaster to hit the country since we started taking measurements of anything. In terms of its fiscal cost, it is a multiple greater than the worst hurricane we've ever had. We still haven't emerged from that yet. We're not back to the level of economic activity that existed just before the pandemic. At the same time, interest rates are now going up. And when you owe a lot of money, interest rates going up are not a good thing for you. The government owes a lot of money. Notwithstanding the impressive debt reduction of the last 8 years, it is still highly indebted, still one of the most indebted countries in the world. So rising interest rates are going to cost you. And we have a populace that is, to put it at its mildest, impatient for economic growth and improved living standards. When you go to work tomorrow morning, in this particular context, at this particular juncture, what is the biggest challenge that you're facing?
Yeah, you put it well. You put it well. We are in very challenging times. We have a lot of good news. The good news that Jamaica is experiencing a very strong recovery, the kind of recovery we have not had before from major economic shocks. And we're recovering ahead of our peer countries in the region. The economic shock here did not nudge us into instability. And all those are good things. Employment is coming back. Unemployment rate is lower than it was before the pandemic. The numbers of employed have increased by 100,000 year over year. However, the crisis has, as you know, what happened is the surge in demand around the world came as a surprise to many suppliers who had made moves consistent with the downturn lasting longer, and getting production back up to the levels to satisfy the demand has been difficult, and therefore prices have adjusted. And that has led central banks to respond by increasing interest rates. In my budget presentation last year, Damien, I would have pointed out that Jamaica is a highly vulnerable country. We are exposed to commodity price vulnerabilities, interest rate vulnerabilities, natural disaster vulnerabilities. And as a result of that, we have to be we don't have a lot of room for error, and we have to be very prudent in our policy making. One thing is that we definitely can't be in this high debt territory for too long, because it makes you riskier. I am happy that we are projected to, the debt to GDP was 110% last year March, and is projected by March 31st to be below 97%, which would be a huge 1-year jump, aided obviously by the strength of the economic recovery. Now, in terms of what my mind is occupied by several things, because they're always competing objectives. As I mentioned earlier, the policy choices that we have to make are often trade-offs, and they're objectives that are in contradiction to each other. And it's in that public space, it is in the space of fiscal policy to resolve those contradictions. So I am, it's difficult to point to any one thing, but I like how you phrased it, the impatience of the society for improved standards of living and growth on one hand, and on the other hand, the need to ensure that policy evolves in a way that's consistent with reducing the vulnerability of Jamaica while providing the best avenue for the country to expand its economy.
Let's just have a look now at the poll results. The second poll, which asked the same question we asked in the first poll, and to see if we get, to see how different a picture we get this time. Let's have a look at those. We wanted to know how much confidence, how much trust people have. And completely so Minister, this discussion and CAPRI's report has raised the confidence level that people have in the handling of COVID expenditure significantly. Those that are very little or not at all are now negligible 4%, down from a quarter at the very start. That's good to know. Minister Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance and Public Service. Thank you very much for spending the evening with us.
So you're breaking up there. I'm not hearing the last part, Damon.
Yes, I'm thanking you for joining us. And I'm now going to hand over back to our host for the evening, Joanna Callen.
Thank you again to Dr. Clark for joining us. Thank you to our corporate sponsors, to the International Budget Partnership, and to you, our audience. Just a couple of things. We'd like to ask our audience to do one last poll for us, which is to go back to Slido and to rate the event that we've had this evening. Again, we'd like to extend our deepest apologies for the delay in the start of tonight's discussion. This was due to technical difficulties beyond our control. We would also like to let you know that we will be launching our report on vaccine hesitancy on March 10th. Tonight's report is available on capricaribbean.org on our website. And once again, thank you, everybody. Have a good night.